and actually, I think it's unfortunately, I would say, the ideal time to talk about your book that is again after 2008. I think this time is even more timely, I'm afraid, because just the unemployment numbers came in the United States are record high. It's basically it's the worst thing. It's like the kind of the bottom fell out, and maybe we're not even in the worst part of it. So I'm wondering. I mean, everybody's wondering if from what you have learned as a historian looking at that age, how similar you think this is gonna be. I mean, eventually, I mean, there is, of course, even in the United States, there's a social welfare state in place. In Europe, even more so. But the question is, how much can that, cushion the blow that we're all experiencing?
First of all, you mentioned my book. It's it's never a good sign when people are interested in my book again. Happened in 2008. But yeah, I mean, for one thing, it is going to be worse, I think, in the very short run in terms of just numbers. Unemployment is hit about 25% at the bottom of the Great Depression in the United States in 1933, just before the transition to FDR. They didn't keep accurate statistics, but as best we can recreate it, it was about that. And I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know the numbers that come out for April, I guess tomorrow, won't be quite that bad, but by the time the next month rolls around, they may be as bad as that, or worse. I saw somebody had predicted like 32% unemployment by the next month. So it's going to be, I think, deeper than it was in the Great Depression. But I would assume that we can get back to not normal for sure, but an improvement, a significant improvement, much more quickly. So if I had to give it a name, worse than the Great Depression, is that the Greater Depression? I don't think so. For one thing, that's too scary, but also I don't think it's quite accurate. I call it the deepest depression is what I think we're headed into now. And I think there is a lot to learn from what was done and some of the things that were not done by the government of Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s. For one thing, well, let me approach this in a slightly more contemporary way. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said in 2009, shortly after Obama came in, when he wanted to oppose everything he was doing, and I'm quoting here from memory, but I think it's pretty accurate. He said, you can learn a lot from history, and one of the things we can learn is that spending is not a solution to an economic downturn. Because when the New Deal had been going on for years, at the end of the 30s, unemployment was still 13%. And what ended the Depression was not the New Deal, but World War II. Well, that's a good example of a statement that is true in a sense, but disproves the point. Because what happened during the New Deal was that the spending went up a good deal, but FDR was afraid to go as far and give as much stimulus as it needed. And so, yes, World War II ended the Depression, but that proves exactly that spending does work, because under circumstances like that, they just spent vastly more than they had in the 30s, and it solved the problem quickly. So that kind of has been a proof of Keynesian economics for several decades afterwards. And more classical economics people who worship the free market, have been trying ever since to find something else to blame the Depression on. And by around the end of the 70s, and when the Reagan administration started, they started moving back towards trickle-down economics, towards taking regulation away, lowering taxes, and all those things. And since 1980, the concentration of wealth and income in the United States has gone back pretty much the same place it was in 1929 when the crash occurred then. And my own view of the main cause, there's not a single cause of the Great Depression, but the main cause is that by the 20s, this country and the Western world in general had reached a point where the economy was based on mass consumption. Mass production requires mass consumption. And during the 20s, people had been kind of weaned away from their traditional values of neither borrow nor lend or be and save for a rainy day and all that. Advertisers told people it was the age of eternal prosperity, the new era. There would be no rainy days in the future and all that. And so the only way it was kept in balance then, because the benefits of increased production in the 20s were going very disproportionately to the people at the top. And so there really wasn't enough money for the consumers to be able to buy all that was being produced. But they kept it in balance for a couple of years by giving people credit, letting them buy automobiles or household appliances or whatever on time. And that kind of staved off the collapse for a year or two, but it made it worse when it finally came, because you reached the point where they not only didn't have enough money in their current incomes to buy everything, but a lot of their current income was tied up paying off previous things. So people had not really been weaned enough off the old traditional values to not kind of go back to the idea that we have some social obligations to each other, and that really came forth during the Depression. However, the idea among a lot of people in business and various politicians of trickle-down economics, of if you just make the rich richer, that will help everybody, which has failed disastrously every time it's really been tried, never went away, and now it came back over the last 4 decades, and we are suffering the same kind of consequences. Just one other point about that, and I tend to talk too long, but one other point about that is that you get into a situation where it's just impossible. Well, let me put it this way: the concentration of wealth at the top, as I said, peaked in 1929. It peaked again in 2008. And it leveled out a little because stock prices that richer people had fell, but it's back to that in the last few years. And no one, I think, has ever really been able to calculate how much percentage of wealth, like in the Middle Ages, was in the hands of the lords. It's probably even larger. And that mattered in a moral sense, but it didn't matter in an economic sense because the peasants didn't need to buy anything. But it definitely matters in a consumer-based economy. And so trickle-down economics is never going to work. So what I was saying about Mitch McConnell, he said this, he was completely wrong. However, he has now gone along without a problem whatsoever in spending the $2.2 trillion and the I can't even keep track of how much the next, I guess another trillion is already gone. And so in a sense, it seems like we're suddenly all New Dealers now, all Keynesians now. As someone said, it seems like, as the saying goes, there are no atheists in a foxhole. There are no total free marketeers in the midst of a depression.
You mentioned maybe before we move on that actually Keynes himself, he visited FDR, and I think I saw that somewhere in the New York Times. He wrote an opinion piece arguing, I think he did that before in the White House with FDR, that it's not enough, that he should have spent more. And you just mentioned that, in fact, the war is somehow proved, in a sense, that Keynes was right, in a sense, that if you spend a lot, you can really cushion the blow. Is that, do you think, you mentioned all these trillions, that Europeans are doing their part, also in Asia, that it's enough this time? You think that it's going to help?
Well, it's certainly going to help. Whether it's enough is another question. And the reason that the Depression came to an end with World War II with the spending was that this was an existential threat, and so they just didn't worry about how much they were spending, and they spent this vast, unprecedented amount of money. It kind of totally eliminated unemployment. You had what was really beyond full employment because a lot of women and others who had not been part of the workforce before were employed. That in turn, along with very high top marginal tax rates, leveled out, well, level is too strong a word, but reduced the inequality substantially. And for that's one of the reasons, but for a variety of reasons, from the end of World War II down into the 1970s, there was this growth of a vast, unprecedented middle class in the United States, some of which had to do with other countries being weakened by the war and other factors. But it had to do with social programs, especially the GI Bill, which usually isn't considered part of the New Deal, but was very much a New Deal program. And people were willing to go along with that when they wouldn't for some other things because it was just for the veterans who needed it. Labor unions being strong, high tax rates on the rich. And so this worked marvelously through the middle of the 20th century, but now we have moved away from it.
Something else that you also wrote in the book, this strange combination, or let's say formula of what happened in the Great Depression, that you had maybe there was a super cycle, a quantitative cycle, then maybe there was even a smaller 9-year cycle, and all these waves somehow might have overlapped. This is one of the explanations I think that you also explain, one of the few explanations that you explain in the book. And I'm wondering, what if, and if you look at it, there's something to be said that actually after this, during the Great Depression, maybe when looking back, was the handover time of let's say the baton from Europe to the United States, because Europe bled out in World War One. We know what happened in World War II, so it was pretty clear that Europe is somehow on, let's say, at the second place in the world order, and the United States is now, of course, with oil being there and for different reasons, industrialization and so on, resource abundance and so on. The United States overtakes Europe during that time. What about if this is also a pivotal moment, that the 100 years of the United States might come to an end during that time? Could that be the case, that it is somehow, it moved from Europe west to the United States, and if you go west from Los Angeles, of course, you end up in Shanghai. I mean, you end up in the east again, from Europe's perspective at least. Is that something that could happen during that time?
It's certainly something that could happen. There may have been something of a longer-term trend towards that before Trump came into office, but he's been almost like an improvised explosive device in just destroying everything in the United States. And again, this pandemic, where the United States has a third of all the cases in the world and more than a quarter of the deaths, with only 4.3% of the world's population. I mean, it's an absolute disaster. And the economic impact, which was clearly going to be bad, even if Trump and his administration, what I refer to as the Trump maladministration, had done what it should have early on, and we didn't have the huge impact in this country. The impact in China and other places around the world would have caused a substantial recession, I think. But because of the mishandling of this for 3 months in the United States, ignoring all the people who were telling him what needed to be done, the United States is going to suffer not a recession, but a depression, and I think that will be the case around the world to an extent as well. As I said before, I'm calling it the deepest depression because I think it's going to be, in the short run, deeper even than the Great Depression. But I think we will manage to come out of it more quickly, in part because people now have the experience and know kind of what needs to be done. But so many people are unemployed and in need of so much money in the short term that this spending, again, it's absolutely huge. But is that enough? Probably not. And you go back to the World War II thing, where it's an existential threat to the country. You just got to keep spending. Really, I'm not an economist, and I've never quite figured out how the country was able to spend all that money and pretty quickly recover from it after World War II. Certainly the dominant position in the world economy the United States held was part of it.
There is so many other interesting parts in your book that I think that people will be interested in right now. For instance, one of the things you lay out, if I understood that correctly in your book, is that what we saw in the Great Depression was a shift of the alliance of the middle class. They always had this aspirational idea that to be part of, someday they will be Donald Duck, they will be rich, right? Maybe Scrooge McDuck. And then afterwards, you write in the book that this shifted, that because people lost their jobs, people were suddenly also at the bottom of the pile, that they saw these fellow bottom, dwellers, let's say, as their brothers more. So suddenly the whole thing shifted to the left, or shifted that the middle class had more sympathy towards the lower classes than with the elites, with the richer class. Is that something that can happen with 30 million people out of work? There must be a huge amount of middle class people in that also as well.
Yes, I think so. And actually, in the Depression, it was kind of two things. One, that people in the middle class, I mean, during the 20s, they had been especially encouraged to, and unemployment, although they didn't officially measure it, was high throughout the 20s. But people had been encouraged in the 20s, like aspiring middle class people, to think that any benefits they got, they deserved to get. It was as a result of them and their own efforts. And so initially, when the Depression hit, a lot of those people kind of thought, well, it must be my fault. When the New Deal started and the program started and people became much more aware that just how widespread this was, oddly enough, it seems easier to see yourself as to blame than to see other people that you know they don't look like they're bad, that they're doing things wrong, to realize that it's a societal problem, it's a problem with the economic system. And so people then would see, instead of aspiring to the top, that they're more in the situation of the people below. But at the same time, that shift in allegiance of the middle class, and of course there are always many exceptions, but generally the shift is also because they are now seeing bankers and people at the top as evil, greedy people and not wanting to be associated with them. I think there's a real potential for that now. For a long time, people have been told, they haven't really been getting any better. The average person in the middle class hasn't gained anything in income over the past 4 decades when you take inflation into account. But they're sort of getting along, and the fact that the people at the top had these ridiculous amounts of wealth, well, that's not really hurting me any. But some of these people, kind of as in the Depression, find themselves going to food banks and waiting in the equivalent of soup lines, albeit in this case in their cars. It has to have an effect like that, I would think, on some of them.
You also describe another cultural result of the Great Depression. And actually, I can see that even playing out with myself, because I told you I sit in the countryside right now, and I was always a total urbanite, right? Total urbanite. And of course, with the pandemic, you can't go to the theater. I mean, all this, the abundance of cultural exposure that the city has to offer suddenly is zero. It's vanished. And now I enjoy looking out of the window, seeing the trees, seeing the green, being in the countryside, which is, for me, rather new. And you described that also that has the same thing happened during the Great Depression with a lot of urbanites, that suddenly the countryside kind of had a new allure. Is that, you think that that's happening again, or why am I experiencing this at the moment?
Well, to some extent that was happening in the 30s. The allure of the country, I mean, some people did actually go into the country. And of course, one of the reasons that the Great Depression was worse than previous ones is each one kind of over every 20 years or so for quite a while got worse than the previous one. And one of the reasons for that is more and more of the population was living in cities where they couldn't grow their own food and that sort of thing. And so some people, there was a back to the land movement that some people participated in. But even more than that, it was kind of the image of small town life that got a big revival. And part of that was just, I think, the idea that, whether this was accurate or not, that small towns, they were communities where people helped each other and that sort of thing. And you see that in movies and novels and things during the 30s. And there's a lot of that emphasis. And of course, as you said, one of the main attractions of cities is all the cultural things that are there. And at least in the short run, and the short run may not be as short as we'd like to see it, those things aren't there. You can tune in to watch a play being performed on your computer or your TV as easily in the countryside as you can in the city. And in the short run, at least until we get a vaccine, the cities are a much more dangerous place to be. So exactly. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Exactly. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about all these cultural changes that you can kind of that date back to the Great Depression, where maybe you have a hunch that something like that might happen, at least in a different way this time around. Is there something that comes to your mind?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of songs, of movies, and things that were pointing towards the idea of cooperation, of even like the John Ford and the guy's name is escaping me at the moment, Frank Capra, even their films, and they weren't leftists, but they were sort of nostalgic for the traditional, at least partly imagined, partly real cooperation that existed among people before. And so you see something like Ford Stagecoach, starring John Wayne in 1939, and the evil guy is the banker who's trying to run off with the money. The supposed outlaws are the good guys, and a prostitute is better than the banker, and all that. And of course, the Capra movies, for instance, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, also in 1939, and that the evil are these greedy people, and the small towns, if the people, including the small business people there, get along with them, and they're willing to pitch in if somebody is in trouble. This is something that's very evident in the Depression, and that's just scratching the surface to mention those two directors. But there's a lot more of it going on then. Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, I think there's Hollywood being what it is, as the right wing would say, a bunch of crazy leftists. There's been some of that already before, but I would expect there'll be more coming.
But and also in terms of lifestyles, because what you describe, you have some of that, at least I guess in the United States, but also in Europe, in let's call it the hipster movement. Where people having communal gardens, and even if they have businesses, it's all kind of socially conscious in a sense. It's eco-friendly. It's more. You don't know about kind of you being not the customer, but some kind of part of the team in a sense, part of the the guys who go to your cafe or something, you cook for them, whatever. It's more not this idea of profit is so central for a certain breed of new entrepreneurs, at least in the hospitality industry and other industries. Isn't that already maybe that the seed is there that they might now grow bigger in a sense, that could be more fashionable in a way or the other?
Well, I think so, but I should preface my remarks on that by saying I'm a congenital optimist, all the evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. But yeah, I really think so. And you mentioned like environmental concerns. Two things come to mind. One, of course, obviously that the skies are blue in Los Angeles. You can see the Himalayas from in India, where they hadn't been able to see them for 30 years. Fish in the canals in Venice and all those things we're talking about. Excuse me, we've gotten an actual demonstration in real time of what we're doing to the environment. Another side of it, though, is that for all the efforts by Trump and his minions and his people on Fox News and all the rest of it to attack science, what's going on with the pandemic itself has led already, I'm pretty sure a lot of people in some polls indicate this, to much more realize how important science and facts are. And that in turn, the people are experiencing firsthand in a short time period the disasters of rejecting science, particularly here with Trump having essentially ignored the science for 3 months, and as a result, I mean, I think he talked about, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and not lose any supporters. When in fact, he's shot 60,000 Americans now. I mean, if you look at the first case was found in South Korea and the United States on the same day. If you extrapolated out the total deaths in South Korea to the American population, it would be something like 1,500 instead of 60,000. So you subtract the 1,500. He's not responsible for them, but he's responsible for about 60,000 deaths, and they're growing. So I think people are certainly going to see more the importance of the people who are scientists and doctors and people who are giving you warnings that you should pay attention to them. And climate change, of course, is something that seems off in the distance, but Trump and Fox News and the rest of them use the same term for the coronavirus as they did for climate change, a hoax. And pretty clearly, although there's some crazies out there still calling the coronavirus a hoax, but to anybody with the remotest amount of sense, they know that wasn't a hoax, and maybe they'll see more that environmental concerns aren't a hoax either.
And behind you there is a wonderful globe that I see, and that what you just said brings me to the question. I mean, also isn't that a unique moment in history that you sitting in a state in kind of a lockdown house, right? I'm in the same situation here in Austria. If we talk to a friend in China 2 weeks ago, they were also still under lockdown in most places. So isn't that it's the first time the whole humankind experienced the same kind of threat, a virus, right? And I'm wondering, do you think that this also means something? That we finally find out that, okay, we are on this little crust of this globe, that the model is behind you on and we're in this together. This is there's no difference now between your life and my life when it comes to what is the biggest threat at the moment to both you and me is this virus. So does it bring us together? I'm wondering whether we find out that we are one human race that live on this planet, and basically, as you said, climate change is just lurking behind the virus once we have that finally sorted out somehow.
Yeah, exactly. The word unprecedented is vastly overused, but I think the current situation is unprecedented. And you look at a map of the world where they're showing a number of cases everywhere, and it's everywhere. Little islands in the middle of the Pacific or the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's everywhere, and people have long said, and I've kind of thought the same thing myself, that the only thing that could bring humanity together is an external threat, like an attack by people from outer space or something that's never going to happen. But in a sense, this virus is that. And so my optimistic side, which I already told you is always the way I like to go, can certainly see that happening. Do need to put a caution out there, though, when we look at how things went in the Depression. Obviously, they went in two very different directions, as they are somewhat now. I mean, authoritarian rulers are using this to clamp down even more. And so part of the reason I think that the United States went in the opposite direction of Germany, and there was a real potential. Sinclair Lewis, Can't Happen Here. Of course, that novel was meant to show it can happen here, and it could have happened in the United States. And FDR had a lot of faults, but basically, I think his approach, his willingness to try ideas, if they didn't work, throw them out and try something else, to listen to people who knew what they were talking about, but then on top of that, his ability to communicate with people. First book I did was a book of letters that people wrote to FDR and Eleanor during the Depression, just ordinary people, and the connection that they felt. When they talked about his fireside chats, many of them had the idea that he was talking directly to them over the radio. That they would say, like you said to me last night, and I don't think any politician has had quite that ability in television. They called Reagan a great communicator, and he was good, but not that good. I often say the only person I know in the television age who could do that was Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but you had to be under the age of 5. But FDR could do it with adults. And so he gave people reassurance. Again, he wouldn't follow the Keynesian idea far enough to give the extreme jolt that was needed to end the Depression, but he made it much easier to live with the Depression. And as a result of that, and then of course also World War II, but both capitalism and democracy were under great threat during the Depression, and Roosevelt was a major contributor to saving both of them. And but there was no guarantee, again, if Hoover had somehow been reelected, and Hoover was not a bad guy, but he wouldn't have taken us in that direction, but things might have gotten so bad that it would have opened the way for that.
Well, that's maybe a question follow up on that if you would advise politicians, European politicians, Asian politicians, American politicians, what have you learned? You spoke about FDR. What should they take from him to weather this storm, to go through this crisis as politicians?
Well, I think one of the most important things, I just mentioned communication, but within the communication, I think he actually, and part of this was because of his own having suffered from polio. I mean, I think that's a big part of what he became because it enabled him. If he hadn't had that, he would have just been a spoiled brat, rich kid. Wouldn't have been able to associate himself with what people were going through. But I think that helped him a lot to do that. But so I think his empathy was genuine. Whether genuine or not, empathy certainly came across when he was on the radio and communicating with people in a variety of different ways. And so, and of course, empathy is one of the things that is absolutely lacking in the current misleader of the United States. But so, expressing empathy, thinking about the needs of the people, not trying to divide, other than the division that's obviously there, that those people who are extremely rich, and some of them are quite willing to participate in higher taxation and trying to help other people. The ones who are just remain greedy, they can be fine as the enemy. That's just 1% or less of the population. But to try to bring everybody else together, to bring them together, and obviously not easy. Trump. Well, Trump, I think, when he said "Make America Great Again," and his whole message was, "Let's go back to the imagined 1950s before the 60s." A book I'm just finishing now is on America in 1964, which I think is really when what we call the 60s arrived. Go back before all those changes. Then go back to the good old days, and the good old days when white men ruled, and that was his main appeal. He ignores, of course, he doesn't know anything about anything really, but ignores the fact that the top marginal tax rate was 90% during the Eisenhower years and so forth. But they want to go back to that, and they exploit these racial divisions and divisions on immigration and all that. I think it's a golden opportunity now to try to bring as much of the country together as possible. And I don't know, 30% of them maybe just seem to be beyond hope. They have joined this cult, and facts don't matter, and hate matters. But if you can bring the other 70% together, that would be a major accomplishment.
And the other part of this question is, again, for you, Professor Vane, as a scholar of the Great Depression, what would you tell people like myself, or ordinary Americans, ordinary Europeans? I mean, should I be afraid now when this Great Depression, or whatever we want to call it, is coming? Or how can I prepare as a citizen, as a human being, to say, well, this is going to be tough, right? I mean, economically, let's forget the virus for a minute, but it's going to be very tough. So how can I prepare myself and brace myself for what's coming towards me with unemployment and everything? And you mentioned solidarity and being together. There's obviously there's something that we need to relearn, maybe from the guys from back in the 30s, right? What is that? What would that be, you think?
Yeah, well, one of the quotations I most like to point out is often ascribed to the American baseball player Yogi Berra, but I think the physicist Niels Bohr made it first. Predictions are difficult to make, especially when they're about the future. So I concentrate on the past as a historian, but I think one thing that's very important to notice in the Great Depression is that the vast percentage of the population, and I'm focusing just on the United States, I haven't studied it that much in any other place, but they were forced to do with less. They didn't like it, but it was okay to do that. But people seemed more willing to help each other when they had less, when it wasn't a matter of, I've got to get myself ahead, because at least in the short term, there was no way to get yourself ahead. And so getting yourself ahead implies ahead of other people. And so certainly you see this in fiction, the Grapes of Wrath, Ma Joad and all that. It's very much in their camps. They're giving what little they have to each other, and that's fiction. But there's a lot of evidence that was going on in real life among people. That when you're at least temporarily out of that race to get to the top, to get ahead of other people, you learn to do with less. Nobody wants to have to do with real hardship. But most people, vast majority of people in this country at least, and in the Western world in general, and the industrialized world, have far more than we need, and we're always being persuaded to buy the new iPhone or something when the old one does everything you could possibly want it to do. And so I think people will move away from that some and realize that, which of course for getting the economy going may continue the problem more if people aren't buying things. But in other words, learning that you can get along with without a lot of the stuff that we kind of think that we need.
So when I hear you correctly, is that basically you're telling me, okay, it might be that I in a year from now, in 2 years from now, I might be a lot poorer than I'm today and financially, but I could be happier, or at least as happy as I am today. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's kind of extreme optimism. Nobody wants to really be living in deprivation. But I think if we realize that we have just been on a level that's beyond what we really need, that we can adjust to it more easily.
What can we learn from this period? If there's anything else that you did not mention, maybe you want to mention it.
Yeah, well, maybe one thing, I've been pushing this idea for a while, that I talked about how Roosevelt, it seems to me, and certainly not unique to me, did a great deal to save both democracy and capitalism under the impact of the Depression and then World War II, when both were under serious threat. I think that capitalism, Churchill had said in 1947, I think it was, that capitalism is the worst of, I'm sorry, let me change that to what he actually said. I was getting ahead of myself. In 1947, Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, except for every other political system that anyone has ever thought of. And I think, like, the American founders understood something like that without putting it in those terms, and set up a political system that was based on democracy because they knew that democracy, while all sorts of dangers are inherent in it, is less bad than any other system of politics that anybody has developed. But because of those inherent dangers, they tried to set up a system of checks and balances to lessen the possibilities of, like, what we're experiencing in the United States now, of a demagogue rising to power. Well, I think that kind of prescription is what we need for the economy as well, really in all countries, and that is to realize that capitalism is the worst of all possible economic systems, except for every other economic system that anybody's ever thought of. And therefore, we need to set up a system that gets the advantages of the market, which are undeniable, but at the same time realizes that inherent in that are very serious problems, including the concentration of wealth and income at the top and various other serious inequities, and therefore set up a sort of constitutional economics that's based on the market but has checks and balances in the forms of regulations and taxes and so forth that keep it from getting out of hand. And I would refer to that as something like just a spoonful of socialism helps the capitalism go up.
Mm-hmm. Maybe my last question is, and a lot of people in Europe, I think, are most familiar with FDR's quote, "There's nothing fear but fear itself," right? What is it that he wanted to say to the American public when he said that?
Well, of course, everybody was terrified. The Depression had hit what turned out to be rock bottom just at the time he was inaugurated. The banks in the country had closed. People didn't know which way to turn. And so the idea that even under circumstances like this, we have new leadership that is going to use a pragmatic approach to see what works, and we're going to try all sorts of new things. We're not going to be held back by outdated ideas. And of course, you're afraid, but the only thing you really have to fear is staying afraid and letting that immobilize you so that we can't go ahead. And I think that's the sort of thing that leaders need to be telling their people at a time like this.
And I think that what you said at the beginning, you said whenever your book comes up, when journalists like myself call you up, then you know that times are really it's really a hard time. And it seems to me that also whenever this quote comes up from FDR, then it's the same thing, isn't it? That we are.
Yes, and of course that's, I mean, that the other thing about that, not so much what he meant at the time, although there was certainly some of it going on, that there are a lot of political leaders or hopeful leaders who hope to be leaders who have nothing to sell but fear itself. That fear sells division. Hitler finding other people to blame things on. It's always them. Uh, them, it seems to me, people complain about four-letter words, but them is probably the most obscene four-letter word in the English language because it divides us against others and convinces us they're not really like us, that they're to blame for our problems. And I mean, Donald Trump, everything he does is, as he said several times in the current crisis, oh no, I don't take any responsibility. It's blamed it on somebody else, and gives people targets. And so that's another aspect of trying to get away from fear and look to what can be done and can be done together.